Hello. My name is Sue Kestner, and I'm here on behalf of the Friends of the Needham Public Library, its board of directors, and the programming committee, who brings you these wonderful programs several times throughout the year, almost always on Sundays at 2 o'clock. And you'll see programs you'll see the next programs on a sheet of paper throughout the room. A plug for the Friends. We are entering our 50th year. It's a wonderful organization with a nominal membership fee, and there are forms outside if you care to take one. Our fundraising activities, most notably our book sales throughout the year, raise money to support enhanced programming for our wonderful library. And finally, a plug for our next Friends program, which happens after the holidays in January, on Sunday, January 8th at 2 o'clock right here. Novelist Catherine Merengue, whose new book called Our Good Name Takes Us to Italy. Today, however, I'm delighted to take you someplace else, to a different part of the world, to Iran. And with me is Marjan Kamali, an award-winning author of 2 books, The Stationery Shop and Together Tea. While Marjan lives in the Boston area and has for quite a while, she literally grew up around the world. Born to Iranian parents, her books are simply, I think you're going to agree with me, steeped in Iranian culture, the smells, the sounds, the food, the language. Marjan was born in Turkey, but she's lived in Iran at 2 different points in her life. She's lived in Germany, she's lived in Kenya, but for most of her life, she's lived in the United States. Her books are, I would describe them as multi-layered, like many good novels, with compelling storylines that just force you to turn to the next page. You can't put them down, and plots that navigate time and place rather seamlessly. Marjan holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of California at Berkeley. She has an MBA from Columbia and almost simultaneously did a Master in Fine Arts at NYU in creative writing, which I think you hear that and it sort of tells you a lot about the author. She currently teaches creative writing at Grub Street in Boston while she works, I'm told, on her 3rd novel. Maybe you'll hear more, I don't know. 2 last points and then I will stop. Copies of the book, The Stationery Shop, are available. Lois Bacon, volunteer extraordinaire, has them. I don't know about you, but I've already purchased 2 copies that I'm having autographed today and will give to my daughters-in-law for the holidays. So consider that. And there is food, thanks to Jan Bowen, who's in the back somewhere, but there's yummy, as my grandsons would say, yummy, cookies and water and cider. So please help yourself and mingle around after the, eat and drink and mingle after the formal part of the presentation, or after the presentation. And finally, our author, Marjan, is going to speak for 35, 40 minutes, and we will hold questions, if you don't mind, till the very end, and then we'll have microphones and be able to take all your questions. All right? Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That was a beautiful introduction, and thank you to the Friends of the Needham Public Library for having me. This is a very full circle moment for me because a long time ago I lived in Newton with people like my friend Julie, who's here, and my son attended preschool in this area, so it's great to be back. I know I'm competing with Mother Nature today. Thank you for being here. These warm days in the fall are very tempting, so I appreciate your time, and I'm going to do my best to make it worth your while. I wanted to start off by talking to you a little bit about my writing journey, how I got to be to the point I'm at today, and then to talk to you about how to stay motivated in your own art, in your own pursuits, your own creative hobbies, and then I'll do a very, very short reading from the Stationery Shop, and we'll delve into Q&A. I know there's a lot to discuss. Sadly, Iran is always a timely topic, but especially so now with Iranian women in the streets leading protests that will hopefully bring about some much needed change. So I'm happy to talk about that too. But first, let me tell you a little bit about my own background. As Sue said, I've grown up all over the world. This is my 7th country. America is my 5th continent. And when I was little and we were constantly moving, people always assumed that every transition was difficult because the cultures in which I was immersed were so different. You know, I lived, as Sue said, in Germany, and then Nairobi, Kenya, and then back to Iran, and then the United States. And particularly when I moved from Iran to the US, people always ask me how I was adjusting because it was after the revolution and the war. And they said, so, you know, they asked the question with the assumption that it was going to be incredibly difficult to adjust. But the truth is, from a very young age, what I learned was that people all over the world are essentially the same. I know that's not the answer that many pundits on TV want, but it's the truth. So no matter the costumes, the language, the traditions, the politics, at the end of the day, on that school playground, in the lunch cafeteria, there was always the mean girl, the queen bee, and her lackeys. There was always a particular kind of teacher with a particular kind of teacher's pet. There were always the same human dynamics. And this is something I noticed from a very, very young age. It was kind of impossible not to notice that. But I want to tell you what sparked my love of reading, because I think every writer, every single writer is a reader first. It's impossible to become a writer without having an incredible passion for reading. So I lived in Iran between the ages of 2 and 5, and then again right after the revolution, right after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And my family and I went back after the Shah was ousted because, those of you who may recall, after his ousting, people were thinking, yay, the dictator is gone. The Shah wasn't exactly a free speech kind of guy. And Iran looked poised to have maybe a better future. So when we went back in the summer of 1980, my mom was wearing her mini dresses, and my sister and I were walking around the streets of Tehran, going to the swimming pools. And very quickly, things changed. When political factions fought for control of the replacement for the Shah's regime, the hardline religious fundamentalists won. And very soon, Iran became a theocracy. So within months, it became mandatory for all girls above the age of 9 to wear hijab. Within months, women's rights went back centuries. Child custody laws, divorce laws, reproductive rights. The marriage age was changed from 18 to 9 for girls. So this was the reality of what we were living. And I had come from overseas. I have a mother who is a feminist, incredibly vocal and strong, and she was displeased, as was every single person in my family, I can assure you, of the slide back in women's rights. And so I was thinking, well, this isn't too much fun, as I wore, my mandatory outfit for school. But then the war began. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. He thought this is a good time to kind of invade our neighbor. They seem to be a bit of a mess over there after their revolution. And the bombs started to fall. And my mom, like most good mothers, tried to make life as pleasant as possible for us. So in the basement of our home, which was our bomb shelter, she stocked that basement with books and board games and coloring books and markers. And she had in her own personal library English books. The books she had were the classics, like Jane Austen, Bronte sisters, Charles Dickens. And so in the middle of the night, whenever the alarms would go off and we had to go down to the basement to take shelter, I would read. I would read the English language books, especially because my sister insisted that I not forget my English, which is a whole other story about bossy older sisters, because she would then make me write a book report. But in any event, as I read those books and I escaped into the words of those authors, I became keenly aware of their superpower. The superpower of these authors to transport me in that basement to another time and place. And I remember thinking, this is an amazing power. The power these authors have by rearranging these tiny pieces of the alphabet on a page, they are transporting me to another time and place. This is before the internet. I couldn't escape into, Twitter. So every time we made it back up from the basement, I was aware of how lucky I was because not everyone we knew made it back up. And I felt like I was the one who got away. I was the one who got away with living, basically. And when we left Iran, with the kettle still on the stove, beds unmade, very few goodbyes said because there was no time, and we arrived in America, I was still keenly aware that I was the girl who got away. I was the lucky one. I was very well aware of my friends and my relatives who remained in Iran in a war. So as I went about my life in New York, at PS 144 in Forest Hills, Queens, and then our local junior high school, and then high school, I was like many immigrant children, the good girl. I felt I had to study really hard to make up for my parents' sacrifices. They had lost a lot in coming here. And when I went to college, I was dutifully pre-med for about 2 weeks until I just told my mom, on that phone in the hallway in the dorms back then, we didn't have cell phones, like, I just hate organic chemistry. So suffice it to say, I did end up becoming an English major, but the idea was, that's okay because you can go to law school. And what made being an English major okay. And then I did apply to law school, but in my personal statements, I wrote about how much I wanted to be a writer. And then the law schools were on to me. I think, they were like, I wonder why she's applying. Thank you, next. So basically what happened in high school and in college is because of the encouragement of incredible teachers who pulled me inside and said, have you thought about writing? And I would always say, yeah, but that's not like what you do. That's a hobby, That's not a vocation available to me because I'm going to be, or supposed to be, doctor, lawyer, engineer, the whole bit. Anyway, suffice it to say that I ended up as a big fat compromise in business school. Getting an MBA at Columbia Business School, which I was aware was a position of immense privilege. The fact that I got in, the fact that I was even there. And those of us who had a liberal arts background, we were taken to what was called math camp, where we had an extra 2 weeks where we had to come up to speed with things like calculus and all those skills that they wanted us to make up for. And I was sitting in math camp one day, and as the fates would have it, the Columbia Business School building is right across the pathway from the building for the Masters of Fine Arts. And I could literally see it out the window, and I kept longing to be in that building. But as our professor taught us how to use spreadsheets, in order to find the bottom line of companies, I started to daydream, and I started to think, well, what if an Iranian mother used Excel spreadsheets to find a formula in order to secure the perfect husband for her Iranian American daughter? For some reason, this was on my mind at the moment. So suffice it to say that it is a common practice in the Persian culture to try and matchmake, as it is, I guess, in any culture. So I wrote that short story in my spiral notebook. And then a few months later, one of my old English professors from Berkeley came to visit New York and had coffee with me. And the conversation went along the lines of, I cannot believe you sold out. We thought you were going to be a writer. Now you're getting an MBA. And what are you going to do? Consulting, Wall Street? And in my attempt to prove to him that I wasn't a sellout, I said, no, I wrote a short story. And I showed it to him. And he read it, and he later said, you know what? You don't realize this, but this is the first chapter of your novel. And you need to finish the novel, send it to me. I'll send it to my agent by this summer. And I was thrilled. I was like, oh my God, this is my big break. Except, friends, that's not how writing novels works. And so I didn't exactly finish it on time. In the meantime, I kept begging my business school to allow me to get a dual degree, to also pursue a master's of fine arts and creative writing. And the assistant dean, who every time I went into her office pushed a tin can that said ashes of problem students towards me, she was very sick of seeing me, and she said, you know, we told you, Marjan, we told you can't do that. No one has done that before. No one has gotten an MBA and an MFA in creative writing. You can do a JD. I was like, no. So I said, what if I apply somewhere else? And she said, you can do whatever you like outside of the school. So I did apply to NYU, and I miraculously got into that program. And then there came these very strange years where during the daytime I was going uptown to the Columbia Business School with all my Republican friends. And then I would do a little switcheroo, like a Superman phone booth thing. And then I'd go downtown to NYU with all my artsy-fartsy liberal friends. And I was commuting from New Jersey. And everybody said, you're crazy to do this. And I said, no, because I remembered those girls I had left behind. I was the one who got away. And there was a lot of survivor's guilt, quite frankly. And I thought, I better make the best of the opportunities given to me, and I'm going to do this. And then I got pregnant. And then people said, you're crazy. And I said, vielleicht, as we say in German, maybe. And then I stayed, well, let's just say that by the time my second child was born, I had finished both programs, and I had gone part-time. It's very complicated. I made it work. Both kids came with me as I got the degree. They crossed the stage with me. Yeah. And then I stayed home. And that was that. I stayed home. I couldn't do it anymore. And then came years of playgrounds and play dates and play groups. And we moved to Australia. And I was at the swing set, and I was changing diapers. I couldn't read, let alone string a sentence together. So the book was put on hold. That MFA thesis that I had began was put on hold. My poor professor, who said to me, send it to me. I mean, he thought I would send it 6 months later. 6 years went by. In the meantime, Professor Leonard Michaels sadly passed away. He passed away. I mean, this is what happens. Life happens. And it wasn't until we moved to the Boston area when my youngest started kindergarten, that I came home, and I remember just kind of walking around the house, swinging my arms, because it was the first time I'd been alone in a very long time. And that first week, my husband, who's sitting back here, said to me, so what are you going to do now? Because, it was like a new fork in the road. And I could go back to work. I could, do a variety of things. And I want to admit I was in a position of privilege because I didn't have to work full time, which I think is important to know anytime you hear a writer's story, that is a privilege. But I remember saying, oh, well, I could go back to work and teaching and all that. And then he said, well, what about that novel? And I said, what novel? And he said, that novel that you've been thinking of every day for the past 7 years. So I brought out the floppy disk. I had to convert it. And I read what I had started to write back in the day when I was doing that MFA program, and I realized I had written the first draft of a novel about a snarky 25-year-old girl who was so mean to her poor mother, because I was a mother now. So I decided to add in the mother's perspective. And in order to not get distracted, every day I went to the Carey Memorial Library in Lexington. I sat in my little cubicle. I made sure to sit in a place where I wouldn't be distracted, so I sat next to the Japanese anime collection. And I worked on revising that novel. And it took about 1.5 years. And then afterward, when I sent it and I got an agent, and that novel became Together Tea, my first novel. And to my shock, it was a Massachusetts Book Award finalist, and it was translated into lots of languages, and I had a ton of fun going on a book tour. And then everybody said, oh, so what's next? And then I thought, oh, so wait, I have to do this again? Because I didn't realize that was part of the deal, but apparently you do it again. So I was reading at a book club for Together Tea when one woman came up to me after the book club finished, and she asked if I would read where she worked. She said she worked in an assisted living facility. And I said, sure. So I went down to Duxbury, Mass. A few weeks later, and I read from my book, and there was an elderly gentleman in a wheelchair who kept saying all these things. He kept saying, I met the Prince of Spain. I traveled with Charles de Gaulle. And the organizers had hosted this wonderful Persian lunch for us, because there's a lot of food in both my novels, and so we were eating, and this man wheeled himself up to me, and he kept saying these things. And everyone else was shushing him. They were embarrassed by him, but I did ask him his name. And later, when my dad asked me how my book events were going, I mentioned this man's name because he had an Iranian name. And my dad, to this day, thinks he knows every Iranian American of a certain generation. And I mentioned this man, and my dad said, oh, he was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain. He traveled with Charles de Gaulle. He met all these world leaders. And I remember just sitting there stunned when my father said this, and then I Googled the man, and it was all true. And I remember thinking, what must it be like to be an elderly person in an assisted living facility with this past that nobody believes? Or maybe they believe it, but they just don't care. And that became the seed for my second book, for the Stationery Shop. So those of you who've read it know that the opening scene is of an elderly man in a wheelchair at the Duxton Senior Center, which is my clever disguise for Duxbury, though every New Englander gets it. Yeah, Duxbury. And in walks the fiancé, the love of his life, whom he has not seen for the past 60 years. So the Stationery Shop was inspired by that gentleman. It is by no means his story. Obviously, I changed it to my own imagination story, this love story. However, that gentleman did become a bit of a fan, and when I did other readings for Together Tea, he would come in. I would see him being wheeled in. And then when the Stationery Shop finally came out, I was invited back to the Duxbury Senior Center because they had heard of this. And I read again, and he had since passed away. Yes, but there were people who remembered him, and we had another lovely Persian lunch. And I kept telling everybody there, now you have to give me the idea for the third novel, which they failed to do. But in any event, I'm going to talk about that third novel in a minute, but I just wanted you to have a little bit of a background of that. And The Stationery Shop is a love story. It's about two teenagers who meet when they're 17 in 1953 in Tehran, and they fall madly in love, as one only can when one is very young. And they are set to get married, but then on the day that they are to meet to get their marriage certificate, the country erupts into a violent coup d'etat. And the country's democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh, is overthrown. And Roya, our heroine, never gets to meet Bahman, who was supposed to meet her at the square. And she searches for him. Eventually, she gets a letter from him explaining his situation. And heartbroken, she moves to the US. She goes to college in California. There was a scholarship at Mills College for Iranian women. All of that is based on truth. And then she meets Walter from the Boston area, and she moves to New England and resigns herself to a life without ever understanding what happened on that day until more than 60 years later, through a twist of fate, she gets to see once again Bahman in that senior center, in the Duxton Senior Center. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just read for you the beginning of the book, because was it Julie Andrews? Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. That way I don't even have to give you context, so I think I just did give you a ton of context, but that's okay. So I'm just going to read you the two opening pages, and then I'll talk very briefly about what's going on with women in Iran, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So chapter 1, 2013, the center. Sorry, these are what my son calls my clown glasses, but I have to wear them. So I made an appointment to see him. She said it as if she were seeing the dentist or a therapist or the pushy refrigerator salesman who had promised her and Walter a lifetime guarantee of cold milk and crisp vegetables and unspoiled cheese if only they would buy this brand new model. Walter dried the dishes, his gaze on the kitchen towel and its print of a yellow chick holding an umbrella. He didn't argue. Walter Archer's penchant for logic, his ability to let reason trump all, was a testament to Roya's own good judgment. For hadn't she married a man who was reasonable and, my goodness, unbelievably understanding? Hadn't she, in the end, not married that boy, the one she had met so many decades ago in a small stationery shop in Tehran, but lassoed her life instead to this Massachusetts-born pillar of stability, this Walter, who ate a hard-boiled egg for breakfast almost every single day, who said as he dried the dishes, "If you want to see him, then you should. You've been a bit of a wreck, I'm afraid." By now, Roya Archer was almost American, not just by marriage, but by virtue of having been in these United States for over 5 decades. She could remember a childhood spent in the hot and dusty streets of Tehran, playing tag with her little sister Zari, but her life now was carefully enclosed in New England, with Walter. One visit to one shop a mere week ago to buy paper clips had cracked everything open. Once again, she was mired in 1953. Cinema Metropole in the middle of Iran's largest city that contentious summer. The red circular sofa in the lobby, over which a chandelier's crystals glistened like tears, smoke from cigarettes floated in wisps. Up the stairs and into the movie theater he had led her, and there on the screen, stars with foreign names caressed each other. After the film, he had walked with her in the summer twilight. The sky was lavender and layered with shades of purple so varied they seemed impossible. He had asked her to marry him near the jasmine-soaked bushes. His voice cracked when he said her name. They had exchanged countless love letters. But in the end, nothing. Life had pulled out from under her everything that they had planned. No worries. Roya's mother had always said that our fate is written on our foreheads when we're born. It can't be seen, can't be read, but it's there in invisible ink all right, and life follows that fate no matter what. She had squished that boy out of her mind for decades. She had a life to build, a country to get to know, Walter, a child to raise. That Tehran boy could very well be squeezed to the absolute bottom of the bucket like a rag, useless and worn out, and pressed so far down into the depths that after a while he was almost forgotten. But now she could finally ask him why he had left her there in the middle of the square. So that's the opening, and then Roya walks into the Duxton Senior Center and sees Batman again for the first time in 60 years, and then we go back and we figure everything out, I promise you. We figure everything out. But actually, I just realized very quickly, I had promised to motivate you all, excuse me, so let me do that, with my writing tips. 7 suggestions I have, which I quickly want to make sure I cover, because in this time, when everybody's worried about politics, midterms are on Tuesday, we've been living through a global pandemic, everything seems to be, quite frankly, falling apart. And in Iran, my homeland, in mid-September, a young woman was arrested by police for having improper hijab. Her name is Mahsa Amini. Her Kurdish name is Jina Amini. And while in police custody, she was beaten so badly she went into a coma and she died. This sparked protests by women, young women mostly, that were then later in solidarity joined by men, women, people of all ages. The protests are going into their 8th week now. Many people, 1,400 people have been arrested. Almost 300 people have been killed, just killed for protesting peacefully. And it's been a very difficult time. So you can imagine that most Iranians in the diaspora have been glued to their phones, trying to kind of follow this, as have I. But at the end of the day, I want to quickly go through my tips for how I stay sane and writing, because number one is accept that it will never be a good time. So those of you, I know I spoke to a couple of you before we started, you are writing. Others might have an artistic pursuit, painting, knitting, pottery, whatever it may be. It's never going to be a good time. I'm so sorry, it's not necessarily going to get better, so don't wait for that to happen. Don't wait for the president to change. Don't wait for the politicians to change. It's never going to be a good time, so you might as well start now. And something I have pinned up to my wall in front of my desk is what Toni Morrison said, which is, I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. English is my second language, so. Yes? Okay. Malevolence. I'll think of maleficent. Malevolence. The failure and chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. There is no place for self-pity, no room for fear. In times of dread, artists must never choose to remain silent. So don't wait for it to be a good time. In fact, speak up now. And my husband knows the one thing I wasn't allowed growing up was self-pity. I have a mom who refuses to indulge in that, and maybe one day I'll need decades of therapy, but in the meantime, self-pity can be incredibly, I think, crippling. So, don't indulge in it. I'm using my mom's advice. Okay, the number 2, break it down into chunks. I think sometimes with art, we wait to have ribbons of uninterrupted time, and maybe that's never gonna happen. Those 7 years when I was taking care of kids, that was valid, and you may be taking care of loved ones, you may be taking care of relatives, parents, fine. Give yourself a break, but then when it's time to sort of focus on your art, don't think you need a week or a day or a few hours. you kind of really only need 45 minutes, and you can set your timer for 45 minutes and start, and then get up and do what you need to do. But in those 45 minutes, turn off the devil's box, which is the internet. Okay, and then go longhand. Those of you who are writing, I know, I suppose in this day and age, everybody's using computers and laptops. I wrote a book called The Stationery Shop. I love stationery. I love pens. I love paper. I think writing longhand is supremely helpful. You don't have the startup costs of a computer. You don't wait for anything to boot up. You don't open a document. You just scribble away. And it takes away that perfectionism that blinking cursor on the screen demands of us, because we associate typed words with perfection. Just scribble in your notebook. I'm a big fan of longhand. Google how many authors you love, write their first drafts longhand. You'll be surprised. You'll be surprised. Number 4 is to make it fun. So you're never going to do it if it seems like a chore and a pain. So when you're pursuing your art, I would say, instead of thinking of it as something divorced from your real life, have it bleed into your real life, make it fun, involve your family members in your projects. My poor husband had to stand behind a tree in our backyard because I had to write a scene where the character is talking to someone behind a tree in a backyard. You know what I'm saying? Like, why not? Just involve the people you love in your art, because the world is too much with us. I love that William Wordsworth quote, "The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, little we see nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away, a sordid boon." We're all gonna die, right? And when we do, who's gonna remember us? Maybe our kids, our grandkids, and then that's it. So just have a good time with it. And then my 5th suggestion is to not do it for yourself. Don't pursue your art for yourself, especially women, I think. If they think they're gonna do this for themselves, then you're more apt to put it off, because it's like, I can't indulge in my silly novel. Let me cook for my children. Well, think of one person who would benefit from your art. Maybe one person who would benefit from your poem, your story, your novel, your pottery bowl, your painting. Do it for them. And I think that's motivating, especially for those of us who think, we have to keep serving others. Serve others with your art. And number 6 is take your writing seriously, because if you don't, no one else will. Take your art seriously. For about 6 years, the moms at the playground asked me for coffee, and I'd be like, no, because I'm working on my book. And after a while, they would laugh in my face, because they're like, I don't know if this book's ever going to be published. This is when I was going to Carey Library in Lexington every morning. And then finally, when it did get published, they came to the book launch with a nice big cake. But the truth is, I didn't listen to their mockery. I took my writing seriously. So take it seriously. No one else will, not even, your dearest. And the last thing I'll say is we are the lucky ones. So anyone who's in this room today is lucky. All of us here are lucky. This is a privilege, right? And it's not like we're digging in a coal mine. It's not like your art is risking your life, though sometimes it does do that. But if you know which countries not to go to, you'll be fine. So just remember, it's a privilege to have an outlet. It's a privilege to have an artistic expression. And I think in the pandemic, those of us who did have an art to escape into were the lucky ones. There were so many mental health problems with the pandemic. There continue to be. But if you are able to express yourself through an outlet, whatever that may be, what a blessing. So why not do that and don't ignore it? All right, that's all I've got, guys. So now I'm going to open it up to Q&A.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. Do we have some questions? Maybe I'll start with one while you're thinking of your questions. But you just can't hear it, yeah.
You want to come here?
We'll share.
Yeah.
All right, well, what I've been interested in the stationery shop is that you write about Roya, well, everybody really, but Roya at different stages of her life, different ages, and very effectively. Like, we get a feeling when we see her as an older woman that there's the core of the younger girl inside of her, and wondered if you could talk about how you'd make that happen, and if it's intentional, or if I'm just making that up.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sue. It's so intentional, so thank you for picking up on that. One of the themes I was hoping to explore with this novel is the idea that time isn't linear. It's circular. And so in the very opening scene, when we first see Roya, she's 77, going back to going to the Duxton Senior Center to see Bahman, her lover from when she was 17. But she feels simultaneously upon seeing him and hearing his voice, 17 and 77. And this is a concept I'm super sort of interested in, the idea that we're all the ages we've ever been and will be at any given time. Kind of like Russian nesting dolls, So I'm standing here before you today, but at the same time, I am the 10-year-old who was in the basement. I am hopefully maybe the 80-year-old who will one day, God willing, live to be that long. So we're all the ages we've ever been. And I think it's a mistake to think that time is linear, because all it takes is the sound of a voice or a scent, a piece of melody, and you can go back in time, right? So that's something I tried to play with throughout the book.
Okay, we have a lot of questions. We're going to have to speak up because you're not hearing this particularly, are you? No. You can hear? Is it better? All right. Maybe there's a little sweet spot right here. All right.
Thank you. I read The Stationery Shop with members of my book group, many of whom are actually here, and because we loved it, and so we're so appreciative to get to hear you speak about it today. I have a sort of a political question, because I have some survivor's guilt about being an American when reading your book, knowing that the CIA had a role, even though you don't go into it, in overthrowing Mossadegh and all the other horrible things that have happened. And I'm just wondering if you think there's any hope for the current Iranian revolution of women to succeed this time, or where you think it's going.
That's a great question. And the 1953 coup that you refer to, that overthrew Iran's democratic leader was, I'm not making this up. Documents were declassified. The CIA admitted that the United States and the UK helped make that happen. So that is the history. It's a painful history. It's a wound many Iranians carry inside themselves, right? That's where a lot of the distrust of the West comes from. That being said, what's happening in Iran today, I think, those protests that are happening today, the people in the streets, they are not talking about the US. They're not talking about the UK. They're talking about their own government and what they feel is their own government's ills, their own government's repression and violence. It's been heartbreaking to watch. It's been hopeful to watch. I hope that it results in a positive change in direction for Iranian women and men. They're affected by this too, very much so. No one knows yet. No one knows yet. But the fact that we're going into the 8th week of protests, I think shows me that it has a more sustained presence. And we just have to, well, I'll speak for myself. I have to hope that it doesn't end in tragedy and that it ends in something good coming of it.
Yvonne, you had your hand up.
Thank you for this wonderful book. It was so texturally enjoyable. I loved all the cultural references, the tastes, the smells, just the interactions in the families. and just the culture, the Persian culture. So that made me wonder where Walter came from. Was he your ideal, what you would like to see a man in Iran be? Or did he come from someone you know?
Yes. Oh, it's getting juicy. Walter, the whole Walter Bahman controversy, I've visited book clubs in person where Team Walter and Team Bahman have had a fight. And people have left the table. And I've just been sitting there like, I made them up. But no, look, let's talk about Walter. Walter is an incredible husband. Walter is an understanding man. You have to be you have to be very secure in who you are to drive your wife to the Duxton Senior Center so she can see again her first love. Now, is Walter my idea of an ideal man? In some ways, but you'd be surprised to know that Walter is based a bit on my own husband. So,
You might have a green shirt on. I don't know.
yeah. I mean, it was my trick because I made him this tall New England white guy, so then no one knows who he's really based on. See, that was my little trick. I think he's great. I also think Batman is great. I really do. And my controversial opinion is I don't think you have one soulmate in this life. You know, Roya and Bahman had something wonderful. It was truncated when they were 17, so she could idealize it for the rest of her life. I mean, who knows what would have happened if they stayed together. But he had his own pluses, his energy, his passion. You know, he had great attributes, and Walter's really different. But she has her shared history with Walter, and I really think that you can love two people. Maybe three. Who knows? Yeah. I told you way more than I should have.
Any other questions? Did you have a question?
I'm blessed with friends, all of whom belong to book groups. And I don't belong to a book group, but I get all these wonderful recommendations. And the Stationery Shop came to me from 3 dear friends. So it just was such a joy. And you're like meeting a celebrity. It's just wonderful. But the question I have, because I can almost taste the Koresh stew. I'm sure I'm not saying it properly.
Yeah.
But it was so sensual listening, reading, and imagining the kitchen and sitting around, and your mother and your sister in the book creating this wonderful. I wonder if you cook that on a regular basis, and maybe you should do a cookbook.
Yes, I get a lot of requests for cookbooks, lots of requests for recipes. I love to cook, and I do cook Persian cuisine and others. But you know, when I was growing up, moving, my family we didn't really live in Iran very long, but my connection to the culture is mostly through the food. So no matter where we were, whether it was Kenya, Germany, what have you, when I came home from school at the end of the day, it was Persian food. And that's what I grew up with. So now I cook it, and I love to cook. I think in another life I would have maybe been a chef, but that's not this current timeline we're living in. Iranian food is very fragrant, and it's not spicy. There's a lot of herbs, and there's a lot of sweet and sour in it. I'm a huge fan. Go to Vanak Cafe Vanak in Belmont to get a taste. Yeah. And now there's so many great Persian food blogs online. You can see all the pictures, and on Instagram there's all these accounts. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the food, and I make it like a few times a week. Yeah.
I'm interested in the hijab in other cultures, is both a symbol and a constraining garment. In France, a liberal democracy, they don't allow young women to wear hijab. In America, by and large, we encourage everybody to express their culture, and I just wonder how you feel about that conflict, whether it's better to allow or not to allow, and what it means to an Iranian or a Persian or a Muslim person who's living in American culture.
That's a really, really good question. I think hijab should be a choice. So if you choose to wear hijab, fantastic, more power to you. But I don't think hijab should be mandated. And one thing we have to understand is that for Iranian women, the question of hijab is filled with trauma. It's not like in other Muslim countries where women, wear it, it's a sign of empowerment, they choose to wear it, what have you. For Iranian women, because it was mandated so forcefully for the past 43 years, it's become a symbol of oppression. And that's not the case for Egyptian women, maybe, or Turkish women, or, Saudi Arabian women. I'm speaking particularly from the point of view of Iranian women. And so when I've noticed when a lot of my, liberal Western friends see what's happening in Iran today, they're confused because they've been taught all this time that, hey, hijab is good, don't discriminate, like let these people wear hijab, and now the Iranian women are burning theirs. But it's because it's associated with a repressive regime. Had they just let it be, then the people who wanted to wear it could wear it, and the people who didn't have to. So a lot of people are worried that what they're seeing on the streets of Tehran today is Islamophobic. I don't think it's Islamophobic. For them, the mandated hijab has become a symbol of this theocratic, misogynistic government's desire to control women. So it's become a bodily autonomy issue for Iranian women. And it's important to separate how the hijab is viewed depending on your country.
Yes, thank you so much for these books. They're wonderful. My question is simply whether you think, and I hope you have a very long writing career ahead of you, whether all of your future books will also be, premised on your culture and on Iran, on your and other experiences.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. Will I forever write about Iran? Is that expected? Do I have to? So the next book that I'm working on, even though the Duxbury people didn't help me with it, but never mind, I forgive them. It does also take place in Iran and the US. And it's, strangely enough, about women's rights in Iran. That's the background of it. I think you should write about whatever you're curious about. So I remain curious about Iran, and I might remain curious about Iran till the day I die. But the minute I'm no longer curious about Iran, I'm not going to write about it. Because if I'm not into it, you won't be into it. I've written about Iran mostly because I grew up not there. I grew up with parents who had a version of Iran that seemed very different from what I saw on TV. And it's a land of contradiction with a very rich history, right? And so I feel like there's a lot to explore. But if I'm interested in something else, I would hope that I'm given the permission by my corporate overlords to write about that.
Hi, nice to hear you. One little detail that struck me, and I don't know if I am misremembering, but is it so that when Roya was in her high school, she had to wear those shoes with the little bows? And when she went to visit Bauman, didn't she also she wouldn't wear boots, but she wore the shoes with the little bows? Is that part of the circle of life?
Yeah, that and a lot of things. Yeah, in her school she wears the anklet socks. The anklet socks, which she's very excited to wear. That's based on an interview I did. A lot of the details about 1953 I got by interviewing older Iranians who lived then, and I was told about the whole ankle socks versus the knee socks. So yes, in her high school days, she wears the ankle socks and those buckle shoes. And then when she goes to see Bahman in, when she's 77, she refuses to wear snow boots because she has some pride and it's too ugly, and she'll wear her little gray shoes with the bows on top.
And if I, just one more question about Bauman's mother and her mental illness. It would, I imagine that if she didn't live in such a constrained and repressive regime, I don't, the mental illness could have been there or not, but it does seem very much related to the circumstances of her life. How did you imagine her mental illness?
I think her mental illness was constrained by the circumstances of her time more so than her regime. Because in 1953, the regime she was under wouldn't have been all that different in Iran than anybody living with a mental illness in the US. I mean, yes, there was a stigma to mental illness. People didn't want to diagnose it. There were no treatments. But I think that was the world over in 53. Her mental illness creates so much harm for herself, for those she loves. And I really wanted to explore this because I think mental illness is on a spectrum. There are the people who we diagnose as having with a mental, they have it, that we treat them even to this day. And then on the other end of the spectrum are high-functioning people who can be very good maybe in their careers or, high-functioning in other realms of their life, but they suffer from a mental illness that creates so much trouble for the people that they love and mostly for themselves. And that's how I was seeing it. So I saw the time she lived in as being the most repressive for her mental illness when there wasn't even the vocabulary to discuss what she suffered from. And the onus was on her immediate family to compensate for her behavior and to carry, almost like a burden. And I really wanted to explore mental illness because I think we don't talk about it enough and we don't write about it enough in fiction.
Any other questions? I have none? I have one last question. Can you hear me? Okay. I was struck with how often you used, we heard about melons in the culture. Melons, the scent of melons, the taste of melons. Tell us about the role, how important melons are in the Iranian cuisine and culture.
So the melon I meant was a cantaloupe. I realized when a young reader sent me a picture of a watermelon, like a tribute, I was like, oh, well, it's a cantaloupe, but that's okay. I realized that, but I did say orange, right? Yeah. So there is a cantaloupe smoothie that I grew up drinking. It's served in summertime. And in the Persian culture, you have this crushed cantaloupe mixed with crushed ice with like a little splash, perhaps, of rose water. And that was something I always loved growing up. So with the Stationery Shop, I wanted to make melons almost like a motif throughout the novel. We know Bahman's mom, before her mental illness is triggered, she's a melon seller's daughter. And we know that the melon drink features throughout. And no spoilers, but at the very end, there's an image. So I'm not going to get into that for those who don't want spoilers, but I was very intentional. Sometimes it's nice to have a thread, kind of like a silver thread that runs throughout a novel. And then together, I had lemons. Now I need a new fruit for this one. Yeah.
Great. Well, this was fantastic. I want to do a couple more thank yous. The Needham channel is here today recording it, so this will be, for people that couldn't come, we'll be able to see it on the Needham channel. And then they tell me probably before Thanksgiving. and on the library website as well. And we have books to purchase, and holidays are coming, so, and we have the author who's willing to sign autograph, so please purchase books. And there's food in the back and water, so please take your food and enjoy it and visit with your friends and neighbors here. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to Marjan Kamali.
No, thank you, Sue. Thank you all. Thank you.